and thank you to the New Economy Network for this invitation. Well, how are y'all? Good. I'm sorry, that's what we say instead of good day. Let's try it again. How are y'all? Good. All right. I'm just trying to wake y'all up because it is kind of late in the afternoon after all this intellectual brain activity that's been going on all day. I'm a little fuzzy myself, so anyway, thanks for hanging in there. It really is a pleasure to be here. It's my 4th day in Australia, and but I've had a rarefied visit because everywhere I've gone, I'm meeting people like you, and I'm thinking, wow, Australia is really progressive. This is fantastic. I wish the United States was like this. Anyway, I work for Food First. We're a think tank. We've been around for 42 years. We were started by an extraordinary woman named Frances Moore Lepay, who wrote this book, a revolutionary book at the time, 43 years ago, called Diet for a Small Planet. Okay, so here's where the generational divide comes in. Who has read Diet for a Small Planet? Yeah, there it is. You young folks, check it out. There we go. She said a couple of amazing things, and I'm not going to get into all of that, but I really feel there's only one way to start all of my talks, and that is that she said, almost half a century ago, she said, we had 1 in 7 people on the planet were going hungry, and we were being told that we had to double food production, otherwise we were all going to die. And she said, oh no, actually, we already produce 1.5 times more than enough food for every man, woman, and child on the planet. People are not going hungry because of scarcity. People are going hungry because they're too poor to buy the food which is being produced. So fast forward to today, 1 in 7 people are going hungry on this planet, and all we hear from the multilateral institutions and from industry is we've got to double food production by 2050 or we're all going to die. In 2050 we're going to have 10 billion people or 12 billion people. Let me tell you, we already produce enough to feed 12 billion people today, and we're not ending hunger. So clearly, there's something else going on. And I'm here to tell you, I'm not going to talk about hunger and scarcity or not today, but I am going to talk about agroecology and food sovereignty as tools for de-commodifying our food system. Some of you might recognize this painting. It's from the early 1900s, when capitalism actually was not very popular, as it is today. Anyway, I think the first thing, I wrote this book, Foodie's Guide to Capitalism, and I'm shamelessly plugging it right now. But the reason I wrote the book is because I work with the food movement, and it became painfully apparent to me within the food movement that a lot of my comrades thought that we were going to be able to transform the food system somehow in isolation from the larger political economic system. In other words, we didn't really have to transform capitalism, but somehow the food system was going to be all right. And I think that that's really a misnomer. I think a misconception. Clearly, capitalism and our food system have co-evolved, and I don't think you can really change one without the other. It's just intimidating to say, oh, we've got to overthrow capitalism in order for everyone to be able to eat healthy, sustainably produced food. It's a big order, but I think that the food system is pivotally positioned within the larger socioeconomic system to introduce changes, and I think that's been pointed out a number of times today. I want to talk about capitalism and the food system by starting with the agrarian transition in the 17th and 18th century, and in which the agrarian transition is basically how capitalism gets going by extracting labor and goods from the food system, basically from peasant economies, and by displacing those peasant economies. And capitalism basically gets going, they were called the enclosures, and that's when they enclose the commons and they levied taxes on peasants because they wanted to get them off the land because the peasants refused to produce enough wool for the satanic mills, the textile mills. And so they really wanted to industrialize the production in the countryside, but you have these peasants who are in the way. being self-provisioning and all that, and selling a little bit of surplus. But they had to get them off, and the best way to get them off was to tax them, because they didn't have any money, and then they had to get money. And then enclose the commons so that the commonly shared resources were no longer there, put sheep on there, and and the peasants had to look for work in the factories to be able to pay for their taxes and whatnot. So this is called the agrarian transition. But there's more to it than meets the eye, because what was happening was that all of rural life was being transformed on the basis of two primary contradictions. Contradiction of labor in capitalism and the ecological contradiction, which Marxists usually talk less about, but it's just as important. I mean, the first contradiction is that capitalism has a tendency to overproduce. And whatever it is, whether it's widgets or food, and it overproduces, and so it brings down prices of things, and then people go out of business, then you create unemployment, and you get what's called the crisis of overaccumulation. In other words, people are too poor to buy all the things which are being produced because they're losing their jobs and they're losing their livelihoods and whatnot. And that certainly happened with the agrarian transition. Millions of peasants were thrown off the land and into unemployment, and that's, of course, you all know about that in Australia. A lot of them were thrown in jail for stealing crusts of bread. They became convicts and were sent here. So something very similar happened in the United States, but it was through indentured servitude. But basically, Europe's surplus peasant population is sent out because of the contradictions between labor and production. The other thing that happens is that there's a metabolic drift, and this was first identified by von Liebig, the father of fertilizers, who said, what's happening is that now that everybody is moving to the cities, we're getting all these nutrients that are being produced in the countryside, and they're being sent in the cities, and those nutrients are not being returned to the countryside as they used to be. And in fact, they're being sloughed off into the Thames, and he complained to the mayor of London about this. Marx then picks up on that, says, that's called the metabolic drift. And we still are dealing with the metabolic drift, and you can see it in terms of the overshoot of our food system and basically our capitalist system. The pollution and certainly global warming is an example of this metabolic drift. I've got a nifty quote there at the bottom. All progress in capitalist agriculture is progress not only in the art of robbing the worker, but of robbing the soil, the sources of all wealth. So most people don't think Marx thought much about the soil or about nature. In fact, he did, and we're beginning to discover this more and more. Remember these two contradictions because we're going to be coming back to them. They are the contradictions which make capitalism completely unsustainable. I just want to briefly touch on property regimes because I do want to talk about the commons. The Roman Empire kind of laid it out for us with res publicas, res privatae, res communis, and extra patrimonium, which basically translates into the public sector, the private sector, the commons, and open access, or what the Western world called open access. Now, we know what the commons is, but I think we have confused open access and apparently empty land for land which we actually wanted to conquer. And so we call it empty. In fact, both in the United States and in Australia, of course, when the colonists arrived, they looked out and they didn't quite recognize what they saw. They thought they saw wilderness. In fact, what they saw was carefully managed landscapes on a broad scale, like nothing we've ever done. And those landscapes were under indigenous management, but for several reasons. One, for not understanding the ecologies, the human ecology of these vast landscapes. And two, because we wanted them. We wanted to colonize those things. So of course, there's not really anybody there, or they're not developed enough, or the natural order gives us rights to that land, or we've got divine right, manifest destiny, white supremacy, you name it, whatever justification we needed to invisibilize the management systems and the people of the areas which we wanted to colonize, speaking as a white man. Now, at the heart of this colonization, what we find are what we call surplus mobilization. And what that means basically is, that's a fancy, obscure, arcane Marxist term, but what it really means is to extract wealth from one place and move it to another. So what happened with the commons, let me start with indigenous lands. I mean, it's easier to sort of denounce it because it's basically extractive and it's called primitive accumulation. You steal it. So one goes in and steals the minerals, or steals the trees, or degrades the land, throws sheep out on the landscape and degrades the landscape, steals the nutrients. And you can do this very easily through things like genocide and slavery, indentured servitude, and convict labor. They can get the job done for you. Those legacies last forever. And we certainly have not overcome any of that. But the commons, I think it's important to realize there's this idea that when capitalism comes in, the commons is enclosed, sort of in its entirety, and the peasants are thrown off the land and they make their way to the satanic mills and to the streets of London or Lancashire or wherever, and they eventually go to the Americas and they come to Australia, completely impoverished. But the commons did not quite disappear like that. It wasn't so abrupt at all. In fact, there was a long period where industry, and certainly industrialized agriculture, which in Britain at the time was called high farming, was dependent on guano, was dependent on the commons. And they depended on the commons because what they needed was cheap labor and cheap food. And the peasantry would give you both. If you restricted the productive and reproductive activity of the peasantry with taxes by enclosing some of the commons, which of course the peasants fought back against for a couple hundred years. This was a bloody process. The peasantry would produce cheap food for you because they didn't charge themselves for their labor. So the food in the surplus food, which came out of the villages, which was supported by the commons, right, brought down the price of food. That's perfect for industry. Then they wouldn't have to pay their workers so much. The peasantry also provided cheap labor. Because they were self-provisioning to a great degree, they would accept lower wages, and that would bring down the price of wages again. So there's this surplus mobilization, a huge subsidy from the peasantry and the commons to the development of industry. Industrialization could never have happened without this tremendous subsidy. And this is really very important to recognize because we like to think of the commons as something which is sort of sacrosanct and self-enclosed, somewhat autarkic. And no, there's been an interaction between capitalism and the commons ever since capitalism appeared. Capitalism has been mining the commons, both for its labor and its food, ever since, and still does in many parts of the world. And so anytime we conceive of a commons, just think about it, because yes, it might provide for some autonomy, but it might also be subsidizing the very system which we're trying to change. Now, particularly with agriculture, it's not so easy for capitalism. I mean, you wouldn't think of it now because capitalist agriculture and industrial agriculture is hegemonic. But in fact, there are barriers to capital investment within farming, within the actual act of farming. One, you can't move the land around. You can move factories around. You can pick up shop. You don't like it here, the market's no good, you can go somewhere else. The labor is too costly here, just go across the border. You can really move around quite a bit. Not so easy to do with your farm. Also, there's tremendous environmental risk in farming, and which is even worse now. Capitalists don't like taking those kinds of risks. And then there's the disjunction between labor time and production time, and this really is the nub of it. And what I mean by that is, if you're producing shoes, you get there in the morning and turn on the machine, and you're producing shoes all day, and then you turn it off after you put in a work day, and that's it. And you sell the shoes. Well, if you're farming, you've got to borrow a lot of money. First, you've got to have the land. That's costly. You've probably got it mortgaged. Then you've got to put up all the fences, or all these fixed costs, your barns, your fences, or this, or that. And then you've got to borrow the production credit so that you can put the seed in the ground and put the fertilizer on it and do whatever it is you have to do. And then you pray for 3, 6, whatever, however many months, right? Until you get a crop. And then you pray about the price in the market. But during that period of time, your capital is tied up. It's immobile. Hmm? Capitalism doesn't like that. 3 months without moving my money? Can't do it. But every barrier to capital is also an opportunity. So bear with me, please. The big K stands for capital. And what we see is that capital doesn't invest in the farming part itself. Let the farmer take all the risks. Let the farmers sit there while their capital is dead in the ground, right? Let's engage what's called substitution and appropriation. By appropriation, I mean the capital appropriates the labor process. So instead of manure, manually applied manures, capitalism invests in fertilizers, chemical fertilizers. Instead of collecting seed on the farm, capital invests in hybrids. And they sell these things to the farmer. So it's the farmer who's got to buy these things, and then he'll take the risk. And then we go through the GMOs and the flex crops and whatever, and you get industrial agriculture. So industrial agriculture is really not about the farming, it's about the selling of the capital inputs for the farming. Now on the other side, with substitution, it's substituting the relationships between producer and consumer. So before, when farmers would produce the cheese and take the milk to market and take the grain and sell directly and whatnot, suddenly we get these long production chains of processing, and they can go back and forth between continents and whatnot. These long supply chains between the farmer and the consumer, and you end up with the monopoly retail chains around the world who have the stranglehold on the food system. And that basically makes up the capitalist food system. So they don't take the risks, and they don't have to worry about the disjuncture of labor time and production time. I'm talking about the corporate food regime, and I've been told I only have 10 minutes, so I'm not going to get terribly into this. Think of a food regime as all of the institutions and all of the rules which govern how we eat our food, right? How we produce and eat our food. It's been developing since the colonial food regime, which the colonies fed the empire, and through the Keynesian food regime, which is sort of state-driven, right up into now, which we have the corporate food regime, which recognizes no boundaries, no frontiers, north, south, east, west, very complex, long, they're not even supply chains, they're nets, supply networks, dominated by corporate, by large corporations. The results have been disastrous. The global south used to be more than self-sufficient in food. They used to produce a $1 billion surplus back in the 70s, and now they're a $1 billion deficit every year. So the south is now dependent on the north for its food. The south produces other things, but not food anymore. Industrial agriculture probably produces up to 40% of the world's greenhouse gases, uses up to 80% of the fresh water, has destroyed 75% of the crop diversity, tremendous forced migration out of the countryside from displacement, making room for industrial agriculture, and of course we haven't solved hunger at all. I want to say that in all this process, particularly in the last 30 years, we see the privatization of everything through neoliberal capitalism, the biggest political loss and social loss that we have is the loss of the public sphere. That's what we have here, and that's what we're trying to construct with the commons, is we're trying to reestablish the public sphere. In other ways, that place where we get to make decisions, and we don't leave it up to the market to make all decisions. Because if you leave it up to the market, the free market, that just means that whoever has the most market power makes the decisions, and those are the monopolies. So what we're trying to do is reconstruct the public sphere and the culture of the public sphere, the civic culture of the public sphere, where we get to make the decisions. And that's where I really see the advantage of the commons. Some of you have heard of agroecology. It's a science, it's a practice, it's a movement. It was developed over half a century ago and continues to develop. But basically, it's farming with nature rather than substituting for nature. Some of you probably have also heard of food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is, in my mind, is the democratization of the food system in favor of the poor. So it's not just enough to say, oh, we're all going to make decisions together. We have to think about equity. Because when someone is poor, they actually don't have as much power as someone who is more affluent. And if we're all thrown together in the same democracy, those relationships reproduce themselves. So we have to find equitable ways of advancing democracy. And food sovereignty is about doing that within the food system. So making the decisions around the food system in a way which give those who have the least amount of voice more voice. And those happen to be farmers. Just quick aside. The industrial food system, for all its bravado, produces about 15-20% of the world's food. Maybe up to 30. It depends on what kind of food we're talking about. Poor farmers produce 70% of the world's food. Most of those farmers are women. And they make up most of the world's hungry. So women and girls produce most of the world's food, and they're the ones going hungry. That's part of the contradictions of capital. Now, here's our diagram again. Food sovereignty and agroecology push back against both appropriation and substitution. Because they're saying, no, we're not going to buy these chemical inputs. No, we're not going to allow you to intervene in the relationship between the producer and the consumer. We're going to claw back those relationships. And I think that's what we're doing in many areas, not just food, but with food it looks like this. So I spoke about the first agrarian transition. There's another one coming. And in terms of labor, I'm looking at we have two choices, I think. One is an industrial food transition, a capitalist food transition, and the other is a popular food transition, or agrarian transition. So with the capitalist transition, they really are talking about this. You know, we could reduce the number of farms to about 50,000 farms around the world and feed everybody with genetically engineered crops and biofortified crops and with CAFOs and hydroponics. You probably could, not terribly sustainable, but you could. The question is, where's everybody going to go? A third of humanity lives in the countryside, and they are poor. So if we throw them off by capitalizing the rest of the food system, where are they going to go? There is no new industrial revolution to sop up all this labor. The world economy would have to grow at about 7% over the next 50 years to absorb this labor. That's impossible. So really, what's being proposed, you know, with modern agriculture, industrial agriculture, and is absolutely untenable, unsustainable, and criminal. You're condemning a third of humanity to misery. If you think we have problems with migration now, just wait. But there's another way. Using agroecology and decentralized regionally based food systems and getting people back on the land, making the countryside a good place to live. Ensuring the health, education, and welfare of the countryside. People wouldn't leave if it was a good place to live. If farmers got a fair price, if overproduction was controlled, people wouldn't leave. There are tools to do this. We developed them back in the 30s. We just haven't been using them. I want to end up here talking again about food regimes. Because food regimes are capitalist regimes. So they act the way capitalism acts. Capitalism always goes through two periods. A period of liberalization and a period of reform. During the periods of liberalization, the gloves are taken off the market. That's what we have right now. That's what neoliberalism is about. Everything is privatized, there are no regulations, and if this continues, it's going to destroy both the environment and our societies. So what happens is that people push back. And they form what's called counter-movements. This happened back in the 30s, after the 1929 crash. And people took to the streets, and reforms were introduced, about the New Deal, for example, in the United States. And they started with reforms in agriculture and with food. Germany and Italy also reformed, but those were fascist reforms. The point is that after these periods of liberalization, reform has to come, but the form that it takes is up to us. Okay, so this completely incomprehensible graph is very important, it's extremely important. And it's the last slide. Is it the last slide? Yes, it is. Look, I've talked about the food regime. And I've been talking about our food movement. The reforms are only introduced under three conditions. One, you have a crisis, a crash. Right? We've had that, and we're going to have more. Two, you have a threat. Back in the 30s, it was communism. And three, you have a powerful counter-movement that demands reform, that forces reformists to introduce reforms. So we've had our crashes. Communism is no longer a threat, for those who thought it was a threat. However, we have global warming, and it's an incredible threat, and you can't exactly establish detente with global warming. What don't we have? We don't have a strong enough counter-movement. And what's keeping us? We're very fragmented. And we need to find ways to converge in all of our diversity to build these strong counter-movements, to introduce not just reforms, but transformative reforms. And I think it's worth asking, what is the role of the commons in building this counter-movement? What is the role of the commons in rebuilding the public sphere? What is the role of the commons in establishing a bridge with the ancestral forms of land management that can help us to address the problems of the environmental problems on a grand scale, much larger than our farms or our CSAs or our farmers markets and I'd say, perfect. If the food movement is a counter-movement, and I believe it's one of the primary counter-movements in the world, like the women's movement, like the climate movement, climate justice movement, it's divided into two trends, just like the corporate food regime is divided into two trends. We have a neoliberal trend that wants to privatize everything and give it to the corporations, and we have the reformist trend, which basically wants the same thing, but wants safety nets for everybody. Well, the reformists are quite weak right now. And so they're trying to build alliances with progressives. Who are the progressives? Well, it's mostly us. We're out there doing it. You know, we're doing the CSAs, we're doing the farmers markets, we're doing urban gardening. We're addressing the immediate problems of the food system, trying to solve these problems, organizing in the neighborhoods. But then there's a radical trend, or movement too, that says, you know what? Let's change the rules. Let's change the institutions. Otherwise, all these promising alternatives will stay alternatives and will never become the norm. So let's take agriculture out of the WTO. Let's have land reform, urban and rural land reform. Let's really hit the institutions and the rules of the corporate food regime where it hurts. So what we need, in my view of things, is to build strong alliances between these progressive and radical trends. Because if we do, then we might have enough social power to create the political will amongst these weak reformists who are being swept along with the neoliberals and the emerging fascists to get them to do the right thing. Otherwise, they won't. There's only two ways to create political will: money or social power. So if we can build the social power, and here's the danger. If the progressives think that they can form alliances with reformists and get the job done, you split the back of the counter-movement, and you weaken it. And then I don't think you get any reforms. So I really think that our challenge is how to bring these different elements together, how to converge in our diversity, how to overcome the things which divide us: the urban-rural divide, the class divide, the racial divides, the gender divides. We have to dismantle patriarchy. We have to dismantle racism. We have to dismantle classism. That is the work. Because if we don't do that, we can't build a powerful counter-movement. So it's great to talk about organic agriculture and permaculture and CSAs and all that stuff, but we can't stop asking, are we dismantling racism? Are we dismantling white patriarchy? Are we dismantling classism? Are we building bridges with indigenous peoples around the world? Because if we aren't, then I don't think we're going to get anywhere. And the urgency is that we have to get there yesterday. Thank you very much.